So when I was in high school, my Bible teacher, whose name was Rabbi Tzvi Blanchard, called me to his office one day and gave me a book. And it was a gift. And the book was The Art of Biblical Narrative by Robert Alter. And he gave it to me because he felt that I would really appreciate it. I had a keen sense of the joy of studying Bible, which Rabbi Blanchard had given me. And he handed me this book, and I read it in high school, and I loved it. It was my first introduction to Bible as literature. It was my first introduction to Bible scholarship from an academic perspective, and it changed my life because I became a scholar of Jewish literature. And when I was looking at graduate programs, I came across the name Robert Alter at the University of California, Berkeley. And I thought, that's the same person who wrote that book that really changed my life. So Robert Alter became my advisor, and he guided me through my PhD and to my PhD in comparative literature. So I wanted to just start with that vignette because Robert Alter has had such a significant impact on my life and on my career, and I'm just so glad to be able to share him with my University of Kentucky community. So I just want to say a few words about Robert Alter, and then I'll let him talk, because that's what you're here for. Robert Alter is Emeritus Professor of Hebrew and Comparative Literature at the University of California at Berkeley, where he has taught since 1967. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, the Council of Scholars of the Library of Congress, and is past president of the Association of Literary Scholars and Critics. He has twice been a Guggenheim Fellow, has been a senior fellow of the National Endowment for the Humanities, a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Jerusalem, and Old Dominion Fellow at Princeton University. He has written widely on the European novel from the 18th century to the present, on contemporary American fiction, and on modern Hebrew literature. He has also written extensively on literary aspects of the Bible. His many published books include 2 prize-winning volumes on biblical narrative and poetry, and award-winning translations of Genesis and of the 5 books of Moses. His most recent book, which was published just this year in the Jewish Lives series put out by Yale, is on the recently deceased Hebrew writer Amos Oz. Among his publications over the past 25 years are Necessary Angels, Tradition and Modernity in Kafka, Benjamin, and Sholem, The David Story, a translation with commentary of 1 and 2 Samuel, Canon and Creativity, Modern Writing and the Authority of Scripture, The 5 Books of Moses, a translation with commentary, Imagined Cities, The Book of Psalms, a translation with commentary, Pen of Iron, American Prose and the King James Bible, The Wisdom Books, a translation with commentary, and Ancient Israel, the Former Prophets. His completed translation of the Hebrew Bible with a commentary appeared in a 3-volume set in 2018, and I can say it's very heavy because I had to ship it to my daughter in Boston. In 2009, he received the Robert Kirsch Award from the Los Angeles Times for lifetime contribution to American letters, and in 2013, the Charles Homer Haskins Prize for Career Achievement from the American Council of Learned Societies. So I am just so excited to have you all here today, and to have Robert Alter here today. And without any further ado, I will let you speak on why the literary form of the Bible matters. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sheila, for your generous remarks. I have to say to the audience that one of the great pleasures of teaching all these years at Berkeley has been having a long line of very gifted students, many of whom have become my friends, especially in Hebrew literature, but also in comparative literature not related to Hebrew. And so it's with great warmth and pleasure that I'm introduced by Sheila, whose eminent career I've taken considerable pride in. Okay, the first thing I'd like to take just a few minutes to comment on a puzzle about the literary form of the Bible. Then I will move on to poetry and from there to prose. I'll probably spend equal time on both because the poetry, which may be a little bit less interesting to you, gives us a kind of paradigm for things going on in the prose. So here's the puzzle. Despite what we customarily say about the glories of ancient Israel, it was a piddling little country, sort of the boondocks in the rich culture of the ancient Near East. Archaeology has unearthed a fairly rudimentary material culture, no great architecture like what we find in ancient Assyria or in ancient Egypt, nothing like the ziggurats or the great temples of Assyria. Also, nothing like visual art beyond pretty much stick figures. As you compare this to the wonderful Assyrian bas reliefs, or to those marvelous Egyptian murals and statuary, you see that on the material and visual plane, this culture did not amount to much, and yet it produced literary works that far eclipsed anything around them and are easily the equal of anything created in the whole ancient Mediterranean world. Soaring poetry, also subtle poetry, as in the Song of Songs, and the most innovative, imaginable, and subtle, powerful narrative art. I don't know how this happened. It is one of those miraculous manifestations of culture, maybe a little bit like Shakespeare's England, where you have not only Shakespeare, but Ben Jonson, Christopher Marlowe, and other remarkable playwrights, all within the space of a few years, although our Hebrew writers span considerably more than just a few years. Now, what I want to say, since some people say, well, look, the Bible's a religious book. Aren't you imposing a misleading category when you talk about its literary art? The point is this: these poets and these prose writers use their literary vehicle in sometimes surprising, very complex ways to convey their vision of God, humanity, history, and the moral realm. And in order to get that vision in sharper focus, you have to attend to the literary form in which the vision was cast, which is why the literary form matters so much. So let me begin with the poetry. Now, it's been known since the 18th century, widely known, there were some anticipations that a basic organizing principle of biblical poetry is a parallel in meaning between the first half of the line and the second half of the line. And there are some lines that have three parts rather than two. This is really as important as rhyme was in English poetry, at least until it disappeared pretty largely with poetic modernism. The The standard explanation since the 18th century has been that the second half of the line is based on synonymity. I can relate a personal anecdote. When I was working on my book on biblical poetry back in the 1980s and spending the year on it in Jerusalem, I met Fanya Sholem, the widow of the great historian of Jewish mysticism, Gershom Sholem. We met at a social gathering, and she said, "What are you working on?" I said, "Well, I'm working on a book on biblical poetry." And she said, "Well, you have to have a thesis. What's your thesis?" So I said, this is in a preliminary stage of my work. Well, I said, something happens, something develops between the first half of the line and the second half of the line. And Fanya Sholem looked at me coldly and said, "No." This conversation took place in Hebrew. She said, and then she recited a formula that she probably learned in a Hebrew high school. She said, "Oto ha'inyan b'shinui lashon," the same matter in different language. And that's wrong. And seeing the poetry that way flattens it out and leads readers to miss some of the important meaning. So let me begin with a very early poem in Genesis. It's the second piece of poetry in Genesis, the first being the naming of Eve. And I'll start with the first line, which in my translation reads like this. A mysterious figure, we know nothing else about him, named Lamech, starts his poem this: "Ada and Sila, oh, hearken my voice, you wives of Lamech, give ear to my speech." Now, the great historian of poetic forms in Hebrew, the late Benjamin Harshav, who was a dear friend, pointed out that the parallelism is not just in meaning, but is often in syntax and often as well in, actually commonly in rhythm. That is the same number of beats in each half of the line. That is, that first line in Hebrew sounds like this. It's more rhythmic than my translation, although I tried to approximate it. Ada v'tzila shema'an koli nishe lemach nishe chazena imrati. So you can hear the rhythm, and every single element here, it's a perfect example of almost exact equivalence. Every single element is parallel. That is, you have the names of the two wives, the second half of the line, "O wives of Lamech." You have listen, you have hearken, and then you have my speech, my utterance. But that is not biblical. There are quite a few lines like that in biblical poetry, but here's what's more revealing and more typical. In the last line of the poem, it goes like this: "For sevenfold Cain is avenged, and Lamech 70 and 7. Now, if the system were based on equivalence between part A and part B, you would expect some synonym of the number, which is hard to do. Let's say if you had six and half a dozen. You can't say half a dozen in biblical Hebrew. So this is a hypothetical example. But that's not what happens. Whenever a number appears in the second half of the line, the number has to go up, sometimes by one, often by a decimal place, or here by a decimal place plus the number, from 7 to 70 and 7. just to show you this is not an anomaly, I will recite a line from Kirat Hazinu, the so-called Song of Moses, in Deuteronomy 32. Oh, how could one chase 1,000 and two put 10,000 to flight, I'm sorry. So you see, you go from 1 to 2 and from 1,000 to 10,000. So what does this tell us about the system? That what seems to be a repetition is not a repetition, but a raising of the ante, a heightening, an intensification, a concretization of what is stated in the first half of the line. And I'll give you just maybe about 4 examples, and then we'll move on to the prose narrative. In that same poem at the end of Deuteronomy, or near the end of Deuteronomy, we have, it is said of God in his relation to Israel during its wandering in the wilderness, he suckled him honey from the crag and oil from the flinty stone. Now, at a superficial hearing, it sounds like it's more or less the same thing, but stop and think a moment. You have a general word for rock or crag, sela, and then in the second half, you have chalmish tzur, flintstone. A flint is a much harder kind of stone. It's also a focusing, because you have, this is typical, you have a general category of rock or crag in the first half, and then a particular kind of stone in the second half. And then let's look at the move from oil, from honey to oil. Now, it's possible that you could find beehives in the crags of rocks and get honey from them. Foragers in the wilderness might well discover sustaining honey that way. But the second half, oil from the flintstone, oil doesn't come out of a flintstone. So whereas the first half of the line is naturalistic, the second half of the line is miraculous or supernatural. So you see what I mean by intensification. Now, an example from the prophets, the first chapter of Isaiah. The ox knows its owner, and the donkey its master's stall. So what's the difference between the two? Again, you could shrug your shoulders. It's pretty much the same thing, but it's not quite the same thing. That is, in the first half, the ox acknowledges the relation of ownership, a general relation with its owner. It's its master's beast. In the second half of the line, you have the master providing nurture to you see, it's again a concretization. You find the master providing nurture to the donkey. Now, the time has come for a couple of sexy examples from Song of Songs. From the last chapter of Song of Songs, the young woman says, "Would that you were a brother to me, suckling my mother's breast." Now, you might say that the poet is facing a challenge because there's no synonym in Hebrew, certainly not in biblical Hebrew, to brother. You know, you could say, I don't know, my male sibling in English if you were doing this, which would be ridiculous in a poem, of course. But in fact, what you have here is, I said there's something sexy about the parallelism. she moves in her line of poetry from just wishing he were a brother so that they could go around embracing in public and it wouldn't be a problem. She moves from that to an epithet for sharing a mother, suckling my mother's breasts. Now that is physically concrete. Again, there's always that impulse, or not, I shouldn't say only, but usually that impulse toward concretization, or I would say also in certain poems, sensualization from the first half of the line to the second half. And of course, what she really has in mind, as she has in mind throughout the poem, is the joy of making love with her lover. And by invoking sucking the breast, she intimates something of the way she would like her lover to relate to her. Okay, one more. Okay, here's one with 2 lines from earlier in the Song of Songs. I had barely passed on from that. This is one of those 2 scenes in which she goes out into the streets in the dark of night, a very dangerous business, to look for her missing lover. I had barely passed on from them being the night watchmen, when I found him I loved so. I held him and did not let go till I brought him to my mother's house and to the chamber of her who conceived me. Okay, so first we have a little piece of narrative, which also often happens, and the scholars don't see this very much, between the first half of the line and the second half. She passes on from them, and then she founds the man she loves so, and grabs hold of him. I held him and did not let go till I brought him to my mother's house and to the chamber of her who conceived me. Now, notice that, again, there's a problem. There's no easy synonym in biblical Hebrew for mother. So she becomes her who conceived me. Now, how does conception takes place? It takes place through sex. And that's what she has in mind. So that second half of the line has a double function. Also, notice the sequence. I brought him to my, I brought him to my mother's house and to the chamber of her who conceived me. So first we have the house, and then we go inside the house to the bed chamber, which again is a characteristic move in biblical poetry. That is, you move from a larger space to a smaller place inside the large space, and that's the impulse of focusing that I talked about. And of course, the focus is an erotic focus because it's the bedchamber. Okay, I want to conclude this section on poetry with an instructive error made by a scholar. That is, there's a wonderful poem with a strong narrative element in Proverbs 7. It's a poem about in which the mentor, the teacher, warns the young man to beware of a temptress. who might be lurking in the streets waiting for him. And it turns out, as we learn when the poem proceeds, that this temptress is a married woman whose husband has gone off on a long business trip. She assures him of that, so hubby is not going to come back and burst into the bedroom. So the prelude to that reads as follows. The setting is at twilight, as evening descends in pitch black night and darkness. Now, in the older version, I'll spare you the name of the scholar, of the Anchor Bible Proverbs. But by the way, that version was replaced a few years ago by a fine commentary on Proverbs by Marvin Fox, who's a very good Bible scholar. So in the older version, the scholar says, wait a minute, if it's twilight, it can't be pitch black night and darkness, right? Those are two different moments in the daily cycle. So the second half of the line must be an interpolation, and we will delete it. Of course, by deleting it, you lop off half of the line, and it doesn't work as prosody, as poetic parallelism. What happens here is a failure to recognize two governing principles in the move from the first half of the line to the second half. One is what I've been stressing, that is intensification. You move from twilight to pitch black. The second is narrativity. That is, the line starts off as the sun is setting and the shadows are long. And then, boom, in the second half of the line, and in the latitude of the land of Israel, sunset happens quickly. In the second half of the line, we're already in nighttime. And that heightens the drama of this narrative poem. Because now that it's pitch black, she really can get her tenterhooks into him, because he's going to be defenseless. And I, the mentor, want to warn this guy to watch out for a dangerous seductress like this. So you see, if you don't see development between the first half of the line and the second half of the line, you're missing half of what's going on in the poetry. You're missing the drama, you're missing the emphatic force, and in love poetry, you're missing half the sexiness. So now, the reason why I started with poetry is that there is a connection between this phenomenon that I've just laid out before you and what goes on in the narrative prose, which is the narrative prose is full of repetitions on the level of verbal formulation, what we scholars in our ponderous lingo would call the microtextual level, and what goes on in the plot, the macro textual level. And yet, the repetitions are only seeming repetitions because something happens. Now, I'll begin. I want to add the following. Biblical narrative I've become convinced over time, works on a conventional assumption shared between the writer and his audience, that you only use a primary vocabulary in the narrative. How do I know this? Well, first of all, it's a very small, very limited vocabulary, and it's hard to imagine that the culture would get along just with that. But then there's the evidence of poetry. That is, in poetry, you have a rich vocabulary that never appears in the prose, and some of it functions in this way of intensifying and heightening parallelism. So, for example, there's only one way to say light, that is, as in sunlight or candlelight, which is or, plus cognate noun ma'or, which means a source of light, or a lamp. If you look to the poetry, you have maybe half a dozen different terms, Ziv, Zohar, Noga, and a couple of others, all which would correspond in English to brilliance, dazzle, effulgence, radiance, and so forth. So the prose writers, with very rare exceptions, limited themselves to this primary vocabulary. Now, when you do that, you're stuck with using the same terms over and over. But what they did, and great artists in any medium do this again and again, is they made the limitation into an expressive virtue. Okay, I'll give you one example. At the in the Akedah story, the story of the binding of Isaac, we have the following. First, the narrator, and Abraham said to his lads, Na'arav, that's the plural of Na'ar, sit you here with the donkey, and let me and the lad, Na'ar, walk ahead, and let us worship and return to you. Of course, he's not saying what he thinks is the truth, because he knows that he's going to return alone after he sacrifices Isaac. Now, I think that my translation is the only one that repeats lad that way. There are other ways to translate that, but anyway. Now, Na'ar means a young man, hence a lad, and it also means, you can see the logic, anyone in a subservient position. So the Na'arim addressed by Abraham are his servants. They might well be his slaves. And then the word is repeated. But there's great poignancy in the repetition, because after speaking to his servants, he refers to his son, Hana'ar, which, as we can see from a couple of other occurrences, is sometimes used by a father as a term of affection. So, and the fact that this son whom he loves, he's about to slaughter, is heartbreaking, and that's heightened by the repetition of the same term. So that's one phenomenon of repetition that's not quite repetition, where you have the exact same word recurring in different senses. But maybe a more prevalent kind of repetition with variation is the following. Now, we all know that biblical narrative is famously sparing in words. And yes, given that fact, it's rather surprising at first blush that there's a lot of repetition of phrases and whole sentences in biblical narrative. That is, the narrator will say something, and then one of the characters will repeat the exact words, almost exact words of the narrator, and then a second, in many instances, a second character will say to somebody else, you know what so-and-so said to me? And then he repeats the words that he heard from so-and-so, okay? So this would seem to be clunky, but what the biblical writers did was to make this into a subtle literary convention. And but by the way, I've been using the word writer. They're not bards. They're not people who compose orally, but they're people who sit with their parchment and quill or stylus and fiddle around with language. So biblical narrative has a kind of verbal flexibility that you don't find for all the greatness of Homer in Homer or another ancient narrative. So let me give you a couple of examples. The first one, this is a neat one which I've used in writing. When Potiphar's wife propositions and then assaults Joseph, she's been saying only two words in the Hebrew, lie with me. And she seized him by his garment, saying, lie with me. And he left his garment in her hand, and he fled and went out. And so, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, here's a virtually verbatim repetition, she called out to the people of the house and said to them, saying, see, he has brought us a Hebrew man to play with us. He came into me to lie with me, and I called out in a loud voice. And so when he heard me raise my voice and call out, he left his garment by me and fled and went out. So she uses the same words that the narrator has used twice, but with, of course, an obvious difference that whereas the narrator correctly placed the calling out after Joseph's flight from Mrs. Potiphar, that is, he scrammed quickly and then she called out. Now she concocts a story to frame Joseph and says, she called out when he assaulted her, and that made him run away. The second thing, and this is really, really a crucial instance of how repetition is used, he left his garment in her hand, said twice. When she tells the story, he left his garment by me. Well, the obvious difference is this. In her version, he's taken off his own tunic, stripped naked in order to jump her. Whereas what happened is that she ripped the garment off his back as he tore away from her and fled. Now, this is reinforced by the following. In the first half of this story, Genesis 39, we are told maybe 3 times of Potiphar, all that he had, he left in Joseph's hands. So there, hand is used metaphorically. It means in his trust, right? But it's a bad mistake, as many of the translators do, or almost all of them, to say in his trust, under his supervision, or some such thing. Because what is first a metaphor, hand for trust, now becomes a literal hand, which is the grasping hand of the female sexual assailant. Then, when hubby comes home. She repeats the same concocted story, except she says this, there's a one-word difference. I'm sorry. She says, he came into me, the Hebrew slave that you brought to us came into me to lie with me. Now, when she speaks to the household people, she says a Hebrew man. When she speaks to her husband, she says a Hebrew slave. Why the difference? It's a significant one, which probably some of you can figure out on your own, even as I'm speaking. That is, when she's talking to the household people, who in all likelihood are themselves slaves, she does not want to remind them of their shared status as servant or slave with Joseph. Instead, he's an Ish Ivri, a Hebrew man, that is invoking maybe some ethnic prejudices. You know about those wild Semites from the north. They could do anything. It's a little bit like our former president's comment on Mexicans. Whereas when she speaks with her husband, she particularly wants to remind him that Joseph is her slave, that a mere slave should have the audacity, the chutzpah, to assault me, where she wants to enrage her husband and bring punishment down on Joseph's head, which in fact is coming. He's imprisoned. Now, one more example, and then I will summarize and leave a little time for your questions. In early in the 2nd Samuel, a fierce civil war has been raging between the house of David and the house of Saul. Saul and Jonathan have now died on the battlefield. And the person leading the Saulite forces is a certain Abner, son of Ner, who has been Saul's commanding general. Now, at a certain point, he asks that Saul's concubines be passed on to him. He asks this of Saul's heir, Mephibosheth, who refuses, and Abner explodes. Now, of course, sleeping with a king's concubine, as both are aware, is a way of laying claim to power. So at that point, Abner says, I've had it with this punk. I'm going to go to David, sue for peace, and bring the 10 northern tribes over to his side, and he'll be king over all Israel. So this is what he does. He comes with a small retinue of men to David's temporary capital in Hebron, and they have an amicable discussion. And at the end of it, we have the following. And David sent Abner off, and he went in peace. Vayishlach David et Avner vayelech b'shalom. And then after a few more words, and Abner was not with David, I'm sorry, and Joab was not with David in Hebron, for he had, I'm sorry, and Abner was not with David in Hebron, for he had sent him off, and he went in peace. And then Joab's men say to Joab, Joab is David's military commander, saying, Abner the son of Ner has come to the king, and he sent him off, and he went in peace. And Joab came to the king and said, what have you done? Look, Abner has come to you. Why did you send him off? And he went going off. Vayelech haloch, instead of Vayelech b'shalom. Now, again, at first glance, if you don't understand the nature of this biblical convention, you might say, well, this is kind of a bore. The same statement is repeated 4 times. Twice by the narrator, once by Joab's men, and then by Joab himself. But of course, the 4th repetition swerves from the verbatim, and it swerves in an ominous way. Instead of Vayelech b'shalom, and he went in peace, you have Vayelech haloch, and he went going off. Now, I will air just for a moment a gripe with my predecessors in the 20th century in translating the Bible. All the examples I look at, because these scholars have been taught in high school that you don't repeat yourself, you look for synonyms, don't do the repetition at all. They find different ways to say the same thing, which is not how the Bible works. Secondly, they translate b'shalom as he went under safeguard, or he went securely. Now, it's true that biblical shalom has a more extended range of meanings than peace, shalom in modern Hebrew. And I'm sure all these scholars responsible for the translations were taught that when they were doing their PhDs. But in fact, they're ignoring the narrative context, which you can never do. That is, what's happening here is a peace treaty between the house of Saul and the house of David, between Abner, Saul's general, and David. And peace is the operative term. And when Joab, who is a bloody-minded man and has 2 things against Abner. First, a vendetta score to even, because Abner killed Joab's brother on the battlefield, and he wants to avenge his blood. Secondly, professional interest. That is, he's afraid, since, like him, Abner is a military commander, that David will decide to replace him by Abner. So he decides this is the opportune moment to kill his rival. And after he utters these ominous words, and he went going off, he ambushes Abner by the roadside and stabs him in the gut and kills him. So you see, if you are aware of the fact that changes occur in the verbatim repetition, and those changes almost invariably open an aperture of meaning, then you can begin to see that more is going on in the story than you had imagined. Now, I won't take time to go into this, but I'll just mention that what happens on the level of repeated phrases and sentences also happens on the level of plot, the macro textual version. That is, there are these repeated stories. A young man in a foreign land meets a young woman by a well, somebody draws water, there's a betrothal and a marriage, or a woman has been barren for a married woman has been married for many years, and then somebody comes to see her. He's either a man of God or an angel or God himself, and this person says, at this time next year, usually that sentence occurs, you will embrace the son. Now, that looks like, again, as with the repetition of sentences, it looks like it might be a bore. And one biblical scholar years ago proposed that it's a reflection of oral storytelling, where the same story is applied to different characters. But in fact, it's a subtle literary convention, because in each retelling of what looks like more or less the same plot, it happens with Samson, it happens a couple of other places, changes are made that are strictly appropriate to the story that's unfolding, or to the protagonist of that story. So with that, I would simply say that you can see from these examples, and I could go on at great length. I could give a whole talk about this repetition with variation of plot and biblical narrative. You can see that what seems simple, almost too simple, or what seems mechanical, like the repetitions, actually is inventive and subtle, and it allows the writers to create in the stories complexities, nuances, sometimes depth of character and situation. So I believe strongly in a do-it-yourself approach to reading the Bible. When the next time you have occasion to look at a biblical poem or a biblical narrative, and you see something that seems to be repeated, ask yourself, is it really a repetition? And if it's not a repetition, then what's going on? What are we being told? What's being intimated? And if you do that, I think you'll discover as readers that the stories are livelier and more complicated and more subtle than you imagine at first. So enjoy your reading.
Thank you. That was so rich. First of all, I'm going to take the first question just because I can, and then I'm going to open it up to our live audience and also to our Zoom audience. I'm sure there are lots of questions. First of all, I just want to thank you. I've always read the Song of Songs, and I've always been told about how racy it is, and I just feel like this is the first time I really understood how racy it was. So thank you. And with that, what's so interesting to me is that we know that rabbinic interpretations of the Song of Songs allegorizes it, makes it into an allegory for the relationship between God and the Jewish people. And yet, what you've shown us is that in some ways, the text itself builds euphemism into it, right? It kind of codes sex into itself, but it's not completely obvious with the use of the imagery of the mother. So that was really enlightening for me. I also wanted to comment on the example that you gave of the Binding of Isaac narrative, where he calls Isaac a na'ar, or a young man, or a servant, or a slave, and that it's a term of affection. Because there's a really strange midrash that says that Isaac was actually 40 years old or 36 years old. I can't remember the exact number, that he was a grown man And I've always wondered about that. You know, the rabbis often do mathematics that I don't follow.
Yeah, me neither.
It's something my husband really likes, and whenever he starts doing like rabbinic math, I turn my back on him. But what's interesting about that midrash in relation to what you read is that really supports the idea that it was a term of endearment as opposed to a specific description of his status or of his age, right? So sometimes this kind of close reading for poetry and repetition can lead you to, you know, to a better understanding of where the rabbis were coming from, I think. So are there any questions in the room? Yeah, so if you could just say who you are and then ask your question, and I'll repeat it in case Robert Alter can't hear you. So
okay. My name is Dan Grifferty. I just wanted to thank you for your talk, Dr. Alter. I thought that was really excellent. Definitely learned a lot. I had a question about what seems to be one of the main themes of what you're talking about, that the Bible tends to use these poetic structures to convey intensification. I was wondering if there are any places where the Bible is using these structures to convey maybe like an anticlimax or like, you know, some sort of moment of pathos.
did you hear that, or do you want me to repeat it?
The sound is a little muffled from the audience, so why don't you repeat it?
Okay, so Dan Grifferty, if I got your name right, thanked you for your wonderful talk and said that he learned a lot. And he pointed to your observation that sometimes repetition can reflect intensification, but he's wondering if you've seen any examples of it reflecting pathos or a kind of softening. Is that what you're saying?
Anticlimax.
It's kind of an anticlimax instead of an intensification.
Well, not really in the poetry. What I would say is there are a few examples, but they tend to be ritual, in which you have verbatim repetition, and it's, I would say, purely mechanical. For example, the offerings of the 12 tribes in Numbers. Each tribe, we got to make it equal, offers exactly the same gifts, and it's reported in exactly the same language. So their repetition is just sheer repetition. But I don't see where it's used for softening. Also, Sheila, I like to say two things, fleshing out what you said a couple of minutes ago. I think that one of the things that's remarkable about the Song of Songs, I didn't really talk about this much, is that it's very sensual poetry, love poetry, but it's very refined also. And I think that's fairly rare in world literature. Second thing about the word Na'ar and Isaac's age. I too am skeptical about rabbinic mathematics. It leaves me in the lurch as much as integral calculus, with which I struggled as a freshman in college. It sounds to me as though he really is a kid, even the way he's loaded onto the saddled donkey. But the term na'al, well, here's an example where it's applied to an adult man. When David's troops go out to fight Absalom's troops after Absalom has usurped the throne, he says, La'at lachem Na'ar Avshalom. Now, we know that Avshalom, maybe he's in his late 20s or in his 30s. I think the rabbis say that Isaac is 37 in this. I don't believe it for a minute, but it's the way, a father would say, the boy is coming home for the holidays from his job in Cleveland. And the boy might be 35 years old, but the father fondly talks about him as the boy. And I think that's the way. Okay, let's go ahead.
Christian, go ahead.
I'll try and project Dr. Alter. I was a student of Gary Rensburg, so I also came up, so to speak, with your book on the article narrative. In terms of, I wonder if you could speak a little bit about Eicha, Lamentations in the Kina meter, as an example of a different kind of Hebrew poetry, and speaking of pathos, how it brings out, especially, it's a poignant set of texts at this moment. So, thank you.
Yeah, well, of course, it's a different kind of Hebrew poetry. It's a lament. Still, I think you see in many of the lines in Eicha the same pattern of intensification. Like you move from, maybe I will just flip to Eicha in my Hebrew Bible, if I can find it really quickly. I never remember the order of books in Ketuvim, in writings. Let's see if I can find it quickly. I mean, I know these lines more or less by heart, but more or less is not good enough. Just 1 second. Oh, come on. I'm getting close. Go. So it starts off with as Eicha Yashva Badad Ha'ir Rabat Yam. Now, here you have a pattern I didn't talk about, but the two halves of the line are not parallel. That is, the second half completes the first half. That is, how did she sit solitary? And then who? The people that had many people. And then you have okay, here's a neat example. I talked about focusing and concretization. She weeps through the night, and her tears are on her cheeks. Because you have the general activity of weeping as an expression of sorrow, and then there's the kind of zooming in, not our zoom, to the tear on the cheek. So you see concretization and focusing. So I think much of the same dynamic is evident even in this very different kind of poetry.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we have some questions in the Q&A, and I'm probably not going to do all of them only because we're already after 8, but I think I'll choose 2 or 3 to
Okay,
discuss.
sure.
So Jeff Peters says, thank you for your fascinating paper. This is a question about your discussion of poetry in Genesis. I wanted to ask if you could say more about the broader shape of the verse form you discuss. In other words, are the 2 halves of the line the same? Do they have the same rhythm, the same number of feet or syllables, or are they uneven, or does it matter? I ask because, as you know, there are verse forms in some literary traditions, much later, of course, that have exactly equal hemistitches separated by a gentle pause. In each line of the poem, the Alexandrine, for example, and whatever the case, is there a scholarly tradition that examines the place between the 2 halves and what happens there in order for the transformation to occur? In short, I'm interested in the formal place between halves and its poetic force.
Okay, that's a very good and sophisticated question.
He's the
Okay.
chair of my department.
Yeah. First, a general observation about poetry. All poetic systems, not every single poem, but all poetic systems are mnemonic devices. That is, rhyme is a mnemonic device. If you read "Behold" at the end of the first line of a Shakespeare sonnet, it's you're not surprised, and you can easily remember "shake against the cold" in the next line. Regular meter, like hemistichs, dactylic hexameter in the Homeric epics, is another way. It's like a metronome, and if you follow the metronome, it's easier to remember the lines. So the system of parallelism, which we can, by the way, I did not say that this prosodic system was not the invention of the Hebrew writers. We know that because we have the Ugaritic writing, which is in a language quite close to biblical Hebrew, preceding the Bible by maybe 4 centuries. The same system is operative, but there it's really repetition. You don't find this kind of subtle focusing and concretization and heightening that you do in biblical poetry. So syllables are not at issue. There are some biblical scholars who don't understand poetry very well, who have tried to make syllable count the organizing device of the system, but it really doesn't work, I can assure you. What is operative is the number of accented syllables. You have the line from the beginning of Isaiah, you have Yada Shor Konehu. That is, you have 3 accents, 3 beats, and then V'chamor Evus Ba'alav. Again, 3 accents. And the poet is free to introduce as many, usually it's not a lot, but he can introduce 1 or 2 or sometimes 3 unaccented syllables in between the accented ones. But it's the beat that gives the rhythm to the poem. As far as the space between the first half and the second half, that's a little hard to formulate. I would say something like this. If you know the system, then you listen to the first half. Of course, these poems were originally heard and not read. You listen to the first half, and you expect that the second half is going to say something fairly similar. But if you know the system, you know that some difference may enter into the repetition. And in that tiny waiting space, you look for what the difference will be.
Thank you. Okay. So Parks Mason, hi Parks, says, in the art of biblical narrative, you pay attention to the artistry of the redactor in drawing together disparate text traditions. What room is there, in your view, for speculative discussion of the literary character of the disparate document traditions themselves, as Harold Bloom tried to do in the Book of J?
Yeah, well, the problem with Harold Bloom's Book of J, I should say, is that first, as the biblical scholar Richard Elliott Friedman pointed out at the time in a review, that he often includes in J things that are not in J and makes a mistake in the opposite direction. He said it's sort of like you're writing about Tolstoy's style, and 20% of your examples are actually from Dostoevsky. Also, Harold Bloom, who did not read Hebrew, although he pretended to, enlisted a rather wretched translator who misrepresented the Hebrew in all kinds of ways. Okay. Now, let's see. I lost track of the beginning of the question. Help me, Sheila.
What room is there for speculative discussion of the literary character of the disparate document traditions?
Okay, right.
Yeah.
Oh, there is room. First, I should say this. Although I made an argument originally in the Art of Biblical Narrative for the artistry with which the redactor blended together different sources, I have to say, and I didn't stress this enough in the book, I think there's a revised version from 2011 where I modified a few things. Sometimes the blending of different sources is very effective, and at other times it doesn't quite work, or there are contradictions that are not resolved. There are definitely big stylistic differences between P, the priestly source, and I'm thinking of the priestly source in narration, not in ritual law, and J and E. The priestly source tends to be beautifully choreographed. It has a certain symmetry and a rhythmic elegance to the style, which is rather different from J and E. Now, the stylistic difference between J and E are moderate. Sometimes you really can't tell the difference on the basis of style. On the basis of lexicon, you can tell. Like in the Joseph story, where the two J and E are blended, sometimes a little confusingly, you have, for example, one of the two sources, I'm forgetting which is which now, uses the word sock, cognate with English sack. There are a few biblical words that are cognate with Indo-European words. He uses sock for the backpack on the camels, whereas the other source uses amtachat for the backpack. So there are those differences, but style in general, it's hard to make out decisive differences.
Thank you. So there's just a few comments that can probably take less time. So Evelyn Elias says, this was wonderful. My husband took a class with you at Berkeley in 1970 and was thrilled to see you, hear you, and learn from you again. Thank you. So that was a comment.
That was in my very early years in Berkeley.
Yes, within 3 years of your arrival. What is your favorite part of the Bible?
That's a little bit like asking a parent who was your favorite child. I would say for narrative, I would pick two books. That is Genesis, especially the patriarchal narratives from Genesis 12 to the end of the book, and the David story, which is the book of Samuel, which is originally one book, plus the first two chapters of First Kings. That is the division into chapters and books was a later editorial intervention. For poetry, see, you really can't compare for favorites between poetry and prose. Well, for me, the very pinnacle of biblical poetry is the book of Job. Even though there are parts of Job that are not quite comprehensible, the text got some of the mixed up, and then there are words that appear nowhere else, and we're not sure what they mean. But still, say the Death Wish poem by Job in Genesis, in Job 3, is one of the greatest expressions of despair in all of poetry. And God's speech from the whirlwind is an astounding piece of vision of creation. So those are quite wonderful. And then a very different kind of poetry, which I'd have to nominate alongside Job, is the Song of Songs. It's very different. It's the sensual love poetry, but it's just beautiful. It's hard to find love poetry that's any better.
Thank you. All right, I feel bad leaving any questions out, so I'm going to ask them. Thank you for that wonderful talk. This is from Diane Aronson Sfarlian. I am interested in the borderline between poetry and prose and biblical narrative, since both make rich use of repetition and amplification. I'm used to early Greek poetry where the form is defined by meter. Are there biblical passages that are ambiguous between poetry and prose?
Actually, I don't think so. Okay, I'll start back with the book that has some real virtues in it, by James Kugel, that appeared at the beginning of his career in 1981, where he had some acute observations about the relation between part A and part B of the line. But then he went on to say there's no such thing as poetry in the Bible. Poetry is a kind of Greek idea, which is alien to the Bible. I think as a pious neo-Orthodox Jew, he was trying to save the Bible from alien corruption. So his claim was, this goes along with the question, that there's no such thing as poetry. There's only a continuum between approximately parallelistic prose and what we call erroneously poetry, where the parallelism is stricter. Now that's wrong. The reason why it's wrong is demonstrable. Remember Benjamin Grushevsky's fine generalization that the biblical poetry is based on accentual, syntactic, semantic parallelism. Those three elements, they can all three of them be there, as in those opening lines of Lamech's poem, which I read to you, or only two or only one. But it's very clear cut that is, if you have, well, I'll recite in Hebrew another line from the beginning of Isaiah. Hoi goy chote am keved avon. Now, woe, offending nation, people weighed down in crime. You can see I made a point of reciting the Hebrew because you can see how clear-cut the rhythmic and also the semantic parallelism is. Boy, goy, chote, 3 beats, keved avon, 3 beats. So this is as clear-cut as running into rhyme in an English poem. It's not ambiguous.
Thank you. And we have one final question, which was the first question by Susan Brown. She says, I missed the reason why we find verbal flexibility in biblical narrative more flexible than in Homer, for example.
Oh, okay. Now, Homer, we've known since the 1920s, and many other ancient epics, is based on formal, on oral formulaic composition, which means this: the bard gets up, he has some kind of stringed instrument. Let's think of it, I don't know, as a banjo, and he strums the strings to mark the rhythm, and in systematic dactylic hexameter, a dactyl is a long and then 2 short syllables. He composes his version of the traditional story, and he's aided by the fact that he has these set epithets which he can stick in to fill out the rhythm of a line, like rosy-fingered dawn, or the wine dark sea, and so forth. Okay. Now, when you do that, you can create wonderfully eloquent poetry, and I think whoever Homer was, he succeeded in doing that. But you don't have a lot of leeway to fiddle around with the language, to shift gears and introduce, as happens in the dialogue, something I've been working on recently, an almost colloquial element, or a stutter, or an expression of feeling aghast. It's hard to do that if you're composing that way in poetry. Whereas in prose, the writer sits with his scroll and he thinks, well, instead of using this synonym, I can use that synonym, and that will be more to the point. And here I'm going to switch this syntactic order in order to give expression to what's going on with the character. See what I mean?
What's so interesting about that answer is I learned about modern Hebrew prose with you, and one of the things that you taught me was that the earliest modern Hebrew writers were writing in a kind of pastiche, just like what you described with Homer, right? Where there were these blocks of text,
Right.
And it was very inflexible, and those blocks of text were taken from the Bible many times. And so it's kind of really using the Bible against its own grain when they did that. So that's really interesting. I'm going to close our session right now. Thank you so very much for your wonderful
Well,
talk.
thank you for inviting me, Sheila, and I enjoyed the astute and, in several instances, very sophisticated questions.
So did I. So thank you all for participating and for